What happened is that we know that in 1991, Soviet Union collapsed, and we see Putin always talking about it, and he's so angry about this collapse of Soviet Union. Why he's like this? He thinks that it was a great uh, catastrophe for Russians. Why what do you think about this? Is he right, or it was it was
Well,
better?
the um, the comment you refer to, I believe, comes from a 2005 speech that Putin delivered to the Russian politicians. And what he said was that the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the greatest calamities in modern history. Not the greatest. There's a lot of people that misrepresent this. One of the greatest. But then he explained it because overnight, tens of millions of Russians
Yes.
were without a home, were without anything. They were homeless. And he said this was a failure on the part of Russian leadership, a failure on the part of history. So there's your answer. He gave this statement in 2005, 6 years into his presidency, and it was commenting on the fact that the collapse of the Soviet Union disenfranchised tens of millions of Russians, Russian-speaking people, ethnic Russians who no longer had a homeland, and they were oftentimes found residing in countries that didn't want them there, that were resentful. 1 minute they're part of the Soviet Union, the next minute they're nothing. And he said that this was unacceptable, and he had a duty and responsibility as the president of Russia to care for these people. And when you say, well, why would he say that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a calamity? Vladimir Putin's made it clear that he's no fan of Soviet authority. He doesn't long for the return of the Soviet Union. What he does is resent the decade of the 1990s. Ask any Russian who lived in the former Soviet Union during that period of time how life was, how difficult life was, how you went from being a citizen of a superpower to being thrown away, cast away by a society that was unable to sustain itself, let alone sustain you, and the struggles of the average Russian trying just to survive. This was the Russia that Putin lived in. This is the Russia that Putin inherited in 1999. And this is the Russia that Putin saved, because there's no doubt about it. If you compare and contrast Russia today with what it was when Vladimir Putin inherited it, today is so much better. You can't find I challenge anybody, a single measurement that says, no, Russia was better off in 1999 than it is today. Not a single one. On every level, Russia is better. Could Russia have done better? Perhaps. But remember that Putin has been opposed by the West from almost day one. They didn't want a strong Russian leader. They wanted a weak Russian leader like Boris Yeltsin. They wanted somebody who would allow the West to continue to come in and economically exploit Russia for their own benefit, not for the benefit of the average Russian citizen. They wanted somebody to come in and destroy, I got a dog, destroy Russian democracy. People say, well, Putin isn't a real democratic leader. I say, really? Has he been given a chance? Because from day one, the West went in and tried to buy a Russian opposition. The British intelligence services are on record, caught cold-handed, sending money to political opponents. In Brazil, would you like it if the CIA came in and started paying your political opponents? No, you'd call that outside interference. The West has been interfering in what we call Russian democracy. But you can't have a democracy if the opposition isn't the voice, the genuine voice of the people, but rather the voice of Russia's foreign opponents. So it's hard for Putin to, A, struggle against this foreign interference, and B, at the same time, try to build a viable opposition. Because every time somebody comes up and says, I'm opposed to Vladimir Putin, the CIA comes in with briefcases full of money and corrupts that process. So it's not Putin's fault that there isn't a viable democracy. It's because the West doesn't want a viable democracy. Why do I say that? Because Vladimir Putin is a good leader. He's done good things for Russia. Maybe he's been in power too long. Again, that's not his fault. When the last time he tried to bow out of the election process, he recognized that there was nobody ready to replace him. That if he left, the people that would replace him would be corrupted by the West. So if the West stops corrupting Russia's democracy with money, with foreign influence, and allows a Russian opposition to grow on its own, then there could be another leader. Putin would step aside. I can imagine that at the age of 70, there are things he'd rather be doing than running a country. I think he'd rather be pensioner, enjoying retirement, fishing, riding horseback shirtless, doing things that Putin does. But instead, he is condemned to govern a country that has no viable political alternative to him, not because he is suppressing it, but because the West is corrupting it.
I see. And Scott, before this war blowing up on our face, we had a tremendous effort by Putin. He tried so hard to bring a negotiation, to reach an agreement, but he failed. He failed on Minsk 1, Minsk 2 agreements. He wanted to build on these two agreements, but Ukraine said, "Oh no, those agreements were unfair. We cannot continue with those agreements. We have to renegotiate." But when Putin said, he tried, even in December 2021, he tried to negotiate with Biden, because he knew that behind everything, behind NATO is United States that is running the show. He tried so hard to negotiate with Biden, but Biden just ignored everything. Now, in February 24th, they started invading Ukraine, and in March he started again negotiating with Zelensky in Turkey. But again, United States was doing their job to corrupt everything, to put an end to this negotiation. How do you see these whole events that came before this invasion and at the early days of this invasion in March?
Well, the things we have to understand is we have to go back even further. The United States has been seeking the destruction of Russia since the end of the Cold War. We do not want a strong Russia. We want to keep Russia down. That's why the United States reneged on its promise not to expand NATO. Almost immediately, once Gorbachev left office, the United States began the process of expanding NATO, even though we promised the Soviet Union that we would not do so. And those promises carried over to Russia. Even Boris Yeltsin, who pretty much a hand-picked American stooge, protested against the expansion of NATO because, he knew his generals weren't happy. Nobody was happy. He said, "Why are you expanding NATO? This is bad for Russia. It makes me look bad when I say I want to cooperate with the United States." Bill Clinton ignored him. George W. Bush ignored all, Gorbachev, Putin after that. Russia could say, "We don't want this expansion," but the expansion occurred no matter what. In 2008, NATO had a summit meeting in Bucharest, I believe. And at that time, they made an announcement that said, "We want to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO." And Russia said, "This is a red line." They said, "We can't allow this to happen." The U.S. ambassador to Russia at that time, a guy named William Burns, today he's the CIA director, he wrote a memorandum. The title of it was "Niet means Niet." No means no. And what he was saying is, when the Russians say no about Ukraine joining NATO, they mean no. It is a red line. And he warned people that if we continue to go down this path, Russia will invade Ukraine, and Ukraine will lose the Crimea and the Donbass. This memorandum was written in February 2009. William Burns knew then what would happen. He wrote this memorandum to the National Security Council, to the President of the United States. Who was president at that time? Barack Obama. He ignored the warning. They instead decided that they were going to embark on a policy of regime change. Now, they didn't call it that. They called it reset. You remember the Russian reset, the nice, beautiful yellow box with the red button and the misspelled word?
Yeah.
But what did reset mean? Reset means we're willing to work with Russia as long as it's led by Dmitry Medvedev. Because in 2008, Putin's second consecutive term as president expired. Constitutionally, he could not continue to be president, but he knew that Russia wasn't ready for a democratically elected person because the United States was buying off the opposition. So he entered an arrangement with Medvedev, who was prime minister, and they switched places for a 4-year term. The United States wanted to exploit this, to go to Medvedev and say, look, you're president. Why don't you stay president? Why don't you kick Putin out of power? You stay president and we'll do anything you want us to do. But what they're really saying is, why don't you stay president and become weak like Boris Yeltsin so we can return Russia to the 1990s, subservient to the will of the United States. Medvedev didn't fall for the bait. Putin was reelected. And from that point on, the United States entered into an active policy of regime change. Manifested itself in February of 2014 with the Maidan Revolution, or coup, in Kiev, where they ousted the constitutionally elected government of Viktor Yanukovych, replaced it with this revolutionary government dominated by ultra-nationalist Nazis, the right sector, Sloboda, people who worship Stepan Bandera and the odious ideology that he embraces, came into power, and they began the immediate persecution of Russians. Remember Putin's speech, 2005. Russians were homeless. Russians were disenfranchised. And now it's playing out in front of his very eyes as ethnic Russians are being burned to death in Odessa, being persecuted in the Donbass, run over by tanks, raped, murdered. What was he supposed to do? He couldn't intervene and go to war. He did provide military assistance, but he was looking for a diplomatic off-ramp. Trust me, if Russia wanted to absorb the Donbass, they did absorb Crimea because historically it is Russia, and they just weren't going to give that strategic base in Sevastopol to the Ukrainians and NATO. So they took Crimea. Ukraine opposed, NATO opposed, United States opposed. But when it came time for Donbass, which is very strategic, by the way, lots of minerals, coal, etc., they declared independence and they said, we'd like to become part of Russia. And Putin said, no, you're part of Ukraine. We have to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. But what we will do is work diplomatically with the French and the Germans through something called the Normandy format. They came up with the Minsk II agreement. Ukraine signed on to that agreement. It wasn't forced on them. They signed on to it. But when the Ukrainians came back, these Nazis told their leadership that if you ratify this, if you do this, we will kill you. We will hang you by the neck until dead. We will give you a new Maidan. And so they didn't ratify it. But now we found out another reason why they didn't. Petro Poroshenko, former president of Ukraine, the man who famously or infamously gave a speech where he said, Ukrainian children will go to kindergarten and school. Russian children will hide cowering in their basements while we shell them. And for 8 years, Ukrainians did shell the Donbass. 14,000 people dead, many of them civilians, many of those people children. When the people say Putin started this war on February 24th, no. Ukraine started this war by oppressing the Russians and then spending 8 years shelling them. But it wasn't just Ukraine, because as Poroshenko said, Minsk II was a sham. It was never going to be implemented. It was a smokescreen so that Ukraine could buy time to have their army rebuilt by NATO so that they would be able to forcibly retake Ukraine. And that rebuilding process began in 2015 when the United States built a permanent training facility on Ukrainian soil where every 55 days we trained 1 battalion of Ukrainian soldiers to NATO standards and then shipped them off to the Donbass to kill Russians. We bragged about it. So for 8 years, or 7 years, we trained Ukrainians to kill Russians. We built up this army. And what we saw in late 2021, early 22, the Ukrainians started to mass these forces in eastern Ukraine. Anywhere from 60 to 100,000 were massed, ready to launch an attack that was going to begin in early March. Indeed, prior to that, they began escalating their artillery bombardments of the Donbass positions, something that's registered in the OSCE observers who were there. They noticed that the increase in bombardment, a dramatic increase, not a little increase. Now, here we are talking about war. What was Russia talking about? Peace. Russia wanted a peaceful resolution. Russia wanted Minsk to be ratified. What did Minsk II do? It required the Ukrainian government to simply modify their laws so that the Russian language and Russian culture would be respected in the areas where Russians lived. It didn't say that Donbass was going to become independent. No, it said the exact opposite. Donbass was going to be part of Ukraine. But it did say within the Donbass and other Russian-dominated areas that these laws that suppressed Russians would not apply, that they would be waived for the Russian areas. That's not asking a lot, but the Ukrainians wouldn't do it. The Russians begged over and over and over again, ratify, ratify, ratify. Indeed, if you take a look at the militias in the Donbass, they began reducing their numbers, going to a near peacetime footing, even though they're being shelled every day, because they said there's no reason for us to maintain this large fighting force if we're looking for a peaceful solution, which is another reason when the Ukrainians built up their forces, 60 to 100,000, the total number of troops in Donetsk and Lugansk was 10,000, no more. So we're talking about a 6 to 10 to 1 advantage. They were going to roll in and capture it. Russia pleaded to the United States to implement this. In June of 2021, Putin met with Biden in Geneva. And one of the things they talked about was the need to implement, and Biden promised that he would get on it, told the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, get this thing moving. But they didn't mean it because Blinken met, didn't do anything. In November, the Russians met with the French and the Germans and asked them straight up, are you going to implement Minsk? And they said no. And that's when Putin realized that this was a sham, that it wasn't going. He made one last effort in December. On December 17th, they promulgated 2 draft treaties, one to NATO, one to the United States, which talked about a new European security framework, et cetera, and the resolution of the Ukraine crisis through permanent neutrality and the implementation of Minsk II. Nobody wanted to talk about it. He had no choice. On February 24th, confronted with the reality that nobody wanted a peaceful solution to this, confronted with the reality that this NATO army that had been trained was massing, they started their shelling. They had the plans to show they were going to start attacking in early March. Under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, Putin implemented preemptive self-defense. It's a right inherent in international law. One only needs to look up the Caroline Affair of, I believe, of 1836, 38, somewhere around there. And it applies to this day. When a threat is manifesting itself of an imminent and urgent nature, the nation doesn't have to wait to be attacked. They're allowed to preemptively respond. And that's what Russia did. They preempted the Ukrainian assault on the Donbass. That's what happened. This isn't Vladimir Putin, brutal aggression, unprovoked aggression. No, the Russians tried everything possible to seek a diplomatic solution to this. It was the West that ignored them. The West that was seeking violence. The West was seeking violence. That's what everybody needs to understand.
Scott, do you think that in the what was happening in the mind of Biden's administration? Because I think they were thinking that they're gonna defeat Russia so easily. They will, because how if you're not thinking that you are able to defeat Russia, why would you go to war with Russia?
Well, I don't think they started out to go to war with Russia per se. I believe the United States, together with their European allies, believed that massively sanctioning the Russian economy would cause so much political difficulty for Vladimir Putin inside Russia that he would have no choice but to stop the military action and withdraw from Ukraine in defeat. It wasn't so much that NATO, the United States, and Ukraine was going to militarily defeat Russia, is that we were going to politically defeat Russia, sanction Russian economy, including the energy sector, bankrupt the Russian economy, devastate the Russian society, enforce a popular movement that led to a Moscow Maidan, a revolution that ousted Vladimir Putin. That was the goal. That was the objective. That was the hope. It backfired. Of course, Russia not only was not disrupted meaningfully by the sanctions, Russia prepared for this, had a plan for it, and they reversed it on the West. It's now the West that's being destroyed, especially Europe being destroyed by the impact of the sanctions. The lack of Russian gas is destroying European economies. So they failed. Now they were in a desperate situation because Russia wasn't going to be defeated economically. Now they have to figure out a way to defeat Russia militarily, and they do that by supplying Ukraine with billions of dollars worth of military equipment, underwriting the Ukrainian economy, again, with billions of dollars of monetary infusions. And the goal here isn't to have Ukraine win. The goal is basically to hurt Russia so badly that Russia would never again try to undertake something of this nature. The United States, sadly, is willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. And that's a tragic statement because the Ukrainians have not shown a willingness to give up. So they're willing to fight. Tens of thousands more will die on top of the tens of thousands who have already died, but it's in a losing cause. Russia's not going to lose this war. Russia's winning, and Russia's going to win.
Um, Another thing we have these protests in Europe. They are we had in Germany, in Italy, in Austria, in whatever in London. You see the people were burning their bills because they cannot pay. I don't know if Europe can continue like this with this problem, with economic problems that they are facing. The giant in the room is Germany. Germany is suffering a lot, and you see, and after that you see the pipeline explosions. It comes to it already is hitting Germans more than Russians, and
yeah. Well, it's going to destroy Germany. It's going to destroy many parts of Europe. I mean, Germany right now, there literally is no future for Germany. They've got no plan B. They can't afford American liquid natural gas. The price of American LNG has gone up tenfold. Even with price constraints, it's 5 times more expensive. And even if Germany could afford it, which they can't, there's not enough of it. Everybody else needs it too. So Germany is doomed. Their economy is going to collapse. Their society is going to go through what I believe is revolutionary change. There's already talk of deploying the German military in the streets to keep things calm. That doesn't work out historically when you put troops in the streets, not for a democracy. So, what has America done? Because when you talk about the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, Nord Stream 2 pipeline being blown up, we know who did it. There's not a doubt in anybody's mind who did it. I know the United States and Western media likes to say Russia did it. Russia didn't do it. The United States did it. We have a president who all but confessed it on February 7th of this year. If Russian tanks move into Ukraine, Nord Stream 2 will be ended. How are you going to do that? Don't worry. We're going to do it. That's a confession. Literally a confession. One of the things that prosecutors like to ask is who benefits? Cui bono? Who benefits from this? Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, instead of consoling Germany and Europe over the loss of a $12 billion piece of critical energy infrastructure, almost was cheering, saying this provides us with tremendous opportunity. Tremendous opportunity. What is that opportunity? To divorce Europe from Russian gas and to open up the European economy or European market to American LNG. Who benefits? The United States. Then we talk about means. Who had the means to do this? Well, it was the United States Navy that was exercising right over this spot in June, using what? Technology called unmanned underwater vehicles, UUVs, including a Sea Fox. Why is the Sea Fox important? 2015, they found a Sea Fox nestled right up to a Nord Stream 1 pipeline. So the U.S. has the means to do this and was actively exercising these means, in the summer of this year. So I could go to court right now and convict the United States for the crime of attacking Nord Stream 1 pipeline on the strength of the circumstantial case. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. We have a confession. We have, the motive, and we have the means all coming together. Where is Germany on this? How much? Can't hear them, can you? Germany's silent. They're not saying anything.
Scott, yesterday, Germany announced that they are starting an investigation to see what happened in these pipelines. Do you see anything comes out of these investigations.
We'll find out. I mean, it's a little late. Um, why didn't Germany launch an investigation on day one? Why didn't the Germans demand to be part of the Swedish investigation, the Danish investigation? Why aren't the Germans inviting their partners, the Russians, in on this investigation? It seems odd that Germany is going to be launching its independent investigation. Do you think we're going to see a report, or do you think the report is going to be stifled or fabricated? We don't know, but it's a little late. You don't investigate a murder 2 weeks after the crime has been committed.
I see. And after that, Scott, we see these explosions on Crimean Bridge, and right after that, Putin responded so hard to I don't know what Putin did in response of those explosions in Crimean Bridge.
Well, let's just start off again. If Russia was at war with Ukraine, then this kind of attack would have taken place on the first day. I've been to war, fought a war against Iraq, 1991. The first day, we hit everything, and we kept hitting everything for 6 weeks. We destroyed all of their critical infrastructure. No electricity. Bridges were down, roads were down, railroads were down, communications facilities were down, political facilities were hit, command and control. We hit it all because we were at war. And then when we decided to finally start the ground war, it was over within 100 hours. The Iraqis lost the ability and the will to fight. So if Russia was at war with Ukraine, they would have done the same thing. They would have started the exact same way. But Russia isn't at war with Ukraine. It's called a special military operation for a reason. And that is that Russia came in soft. They didn't want to harm the infrastructure. They don't want to kill civilians. And they really don't want to kill Ukrainian soldiers. They prefer that the Ukrainian soldiers put down their weapons, surrendered, and be processed. For 8 months, Russia's been fighting this way. And they started out okay. They got better over the course of the summer, but then NATO dramatically reinforced Ukraine, and the new Ukrainian army came, and Russia got embarrassed in September with this counteroffensive. Russia responded by mobilizing 300,000 reservists. Russia appointed a new leader, this General Suvarkin, nicknamed Armageddon. But then Russia was still sort of appearing to be doing the same thing, the same soft approach, while they were waiting for the mobilization to come up. But Russia had said for some time now, don't bomb the bridge. It's a red line. Don't bomb the bridge. Don't attack the bridge. Don't. Ukraine did. And that transformed everything. Now Russia is attacking Ukraine as if it were at war because Ukraine decided to escalate. Ukraine made the decision to attack the bridge. Prior to this, no matter what Ukraine did, whether it included shelling Russian towns inside Russian territory, attacking nuclear power plant, Russia didn't escalate. But because Ukraine attacked a bridge that is a critical piece of infrastructure, Russia is now raising the price on Ukraine. We'll see how long this goes. If it were me, it would go forever. But Russia, again, doesn't want to harm Ukraine. They don't want to harm the Ukrainian people. So there might be a let-up, but there might not be. There's a new general who was told he can do anything he wants except use a nuclear weapon to resolve this issue. So he's escalated the air campaign dramatically while he builds up his ground forces.
News came out today that Elon Musk, that he's providing internet to Ukrainian. He is thinking that he cannot do this anymore. He wanna slow it down, and he's gonna end it. How important is this connection in Starlink internet for Ukrainian for these operations by Ukrainian?
My understanding is that the Starlink satellites are absolutely critical to Ukraine's ability to exercise command and control, that they were a game changer when they were brought in, and that they have Elon Musk to thank for this. Elon, I think, has had a moment of clarity where he recognizes that Ukraine cannot win this conflict. In order to mitigate the losses, he's rightfully advocating for a diplomatic solution. Whether or not the specifics that he put forward will be, finalized, that's up to Russia and Ukraine, not Elon Musk. But the point is, he's correct to say that there's no military solution here. It must be a diplomatic solution. So he's advocating for that. But rather than respecting that, as any responsible nation would do, Ukraine condemned him. He was told by, very powerful people to, basically shut the beep up, stay out of our business, get out of here. Well, as Elon Musk said when he announced his decision not to continue funding it, he said, I was told to get out of here. That's what I'm doing. So Musk is withdrawing. If somebody doesn't pick up the bill and pay for this, it will be devastating for the Ukrainians because they need those satellites to carry out the kind of communications necessary to direct their military in the field.
I see. And we see today yesterday Prime Minister of Hungarian Prime Minister, he said the only way out of this conflict is Trump in office. Do you think that it's gonna change anything if Trump wins 2024? Does it change? United States gonna change its policy in Ukraine or not? What do you think?
I mean, in theory, it could, because Trump has, he's expressed policies that seem to be sympathetic to Russia. But one has to remember, for 4 years, even though he said, why can't we be friends? He sanctioned Russia. He spoke tough about Russia. So the idea that Trump's going to come in and be, some softy, I don't believe. But the other thing, too, is that Trump, if he gets elected, America is going to be in an uproar. We're already near Civil War type status, and his election will just explode America because the Democrats just won't be satisfied with that outcome. And so I don't know if Trump will have the ability to focus on Ukraine. I think he'll be too busy trying to prevent prevent violence in American streets. At the end of the day, though, it's not American leadership that's, because there is no American leadership. America doesn't lead anymore. We direct, we dictate, we don't lead. Unfortunately, the only way this conflict ends is with a complete Russian victory, total victory, unconditional surrender of Ukraine, and then it's up to Russia to define the terms. And I believe that Russia is interested in long-term stability. Russia's not the United States. They don't want to do a victory dance over the grave of their enemy. What Russia wants is long-term stability. So a Russian victory is probably the best thing that could happen to Ukraine, because Russians aren't vindictive. Russians would seek to come up with some sort of equitable conclusion to this problem. But unfortunately, before they get to that, tens of thousands of more Ukrainians are going to have to die.
Scott, some experts says that unipolarity of the United States ended in 2017. And 2017. And do you think that it happened? It already happened, as Putin says in his recent speech. He said that we are going to get a new order in this world.
Well, I think it's already happened. Ask yourself this: who was one of America's closest allies in the Middle East? Saudi Arabia. Since 1945, Saudi Arabia and the United States have had a very special relationship that's built around Saudi Arabia's role as the guarantor of energy security. If the United States needed more oil to go on the international market, Saudi Arabia would increase its oil. They overdeveloped their oil fields. If the United States needed less oil on the market, Saudi Arabia would decrease based upon the commands of the United States. This past July, Joe Biden went to Saudi Arabia after promising during the campaign he would never do any such thing, after calling out the Saudi leader, rightfully so, as a pariah for his role in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. But in July, Biden went there, shook hands, violated all of his principles, got on his knees and begged the Saudis to do one thing: produce more oil. Biden wanted the Saudis to increase oil production by, I believe, somewhere around 1 million barrels a day. While Biden was making that argument, he was depleting the American strategic oil reserve dumping American oil onto the market to try and control the price. The price, which by the way was out of control, not because of anything Russia did, but because of the sanctions the United States and Europe placed on Russian energy. But the price wasn't stabilizing. Biden needed more oil. He begged the Saudis to produce 1 million more barrels a day. Saudi Arabia said, we'll consider it, but we have to discuss it with our colleagues in the OPEC Plus meeting in August. The plus is Russia. So Russia was actually in the driver's seat when it comes time to dictating American energy security. And what Russia and Saudi Arabia finally agreed upon this month is that they're not going to increase oil. They're going to decrease oil by 2 million barrels a day. This put Joe Biden in a tremendous bind. We have a midterm election coming up, and we're going to see gas prices going up. It's almost like a fatal blow to the prospects of the Democrats who are running to try and retain control of the House and the Senate. But Russia controls the energy market, not the United States. We're seeing, the key to a unipolar world was, American dominance of the global economic scene. And part of that dominance came from the role of the dollar as the global reserve currency. But, what is Saudi Arabia doing right now? They're doing oil contracts with China using the Chinese currency. They're executing oil contracts with India using the Indian currency, oil contracts with Russia using the Russian currency. This is just a statement of fact. We see the Iranians doing the same thing. We're seeing the world talking about an alternative to the dollar. They're talking about creating this currency basket of reserve currencies. It's not a unipolar world anymore. It's a multipolar world. And for the United States, the bad news is, or the worst news, the bad news is it's a multipolar world. The worst news is the multipolar world doesn't like the United States and is willing to work without the United States. And so, the United States is rapidly finding itself to be, the man on the outside, trapped on the outside, looking in. It's not a good position for the United States, but it's one that reflects the global reality that we no longer live in a unipolar world.
I see. Scott, we saw how United States in Iraq, in Afghanistan, just left the country after years and years of occupation. And do you think that's gonna do the same to Ukrainians?
Yes, the United States is not a good friend. We're the worst friend imaginable. We will abandon you in a heartbeat when it becomes inconvenient for the United States. Already we're seeing Ukraine becoming inconvenient. We saw the United States throw them under the bus when it came to the assassination of Daria Dugina. The CIA calling the New York Times and saying that the Ukrainian intelligence service carried out this crime and that the United States had nothing to do with it, that it was ordered by the office of the presidency. What does that mean? That means Ukrainian intelligence services carried out a terrorist action. Terrorist action. The assassination of a journalist is a terrorist action. So they're a terrorist organization, and they received orders from the Ukrainian government, which makes the Ukrainian government a state sponsor of terror. Now, that terminology is not being used in the United States, but it's a reflection of reality. Ukraine is a state sponsor of terrorism, and the United States supports them.
I see. What we've seen so far, it was the United States behind everything, and you see Germany, United Kingdom, they all say what United States want them to say, and I see it's so amazing for me. Before this war breaks out, I never thought of Europe like this. That I see no sovereignty, I see no freedom in Europe. They cannot see their benefits. It's so amazing. I don't know if you saw this even before this war breaks out. For me personally, it was so amazing seeing Europe suffering a lot because their need of energy that comes from Russia. But the United States doesn't care. The Secretary of State said, "Oh, we have to keep an eye on our economy, United States economy. We have to provide our people Nobody's talking about people who are leaving Europe.
Look, it's a statement of fact. The reality is, if we take a look at the role that Russian gas has played in European development over the past 5, 6 decades, we can make the following conclusion. Europe, in the high standard of living that it enjoys, the free education, the free health care, the long vacations, good standard of living, et cetera, this only happened because of cheap Russian gas. If Europe had to pay full market value for energy, they wouldn't be enjoying all these perks. So Europe became accustomed to this, but then the other reality is that Europe is 100% beholden to the United States politically and militarily. That without the United States being there, NATO countries would go bankrupt by trying to build the military necessary to defend themselves from a potential Russian enemy. They need the United States. They also want to continue to be players in the so-called rules-based international order that the United States imposed on the world in the aftermath of the Second World War. Nobody wants to get away with that because there was no alternative. But today there's an alternative. It's called BRICS. BRICS is an alternative to the G7. BRICS is better than the G7. The G7 is no longer the G7. If it's the 7 most developed economies in the world, many of them are dropping out. Germany won't qualify very soon. France won't qualify. England won't qualify. So what's the G4? Well, the European Union won't qualify, so they're out. Come on, it's a joke. BRICS, on the other hand, is doing quite well. The economies are stable and growing. This currency, the petrodollar, they're walking away from the petrodollar of the world. Europe is trapped by its own. It's a sad state of affairs. The only, I guess, light that one can see is the potential that there would be revolutionary change that the situation would become so bad that the people will rise up, kick out these corrupt political and economic elites and replace them with some sort of political power that cares more about the people than they do about power. If that's the case, then Europe will be able to once again get on its feet. I don't know if they'll ever be able to rebuild to where they were before this, but at least they won't be a third world nation. But they'll have to use Russian gas to make this happen, whether that gas comes from a rebuilt Nord Stream 2 or it comes from an expanded Turk Stream or a combination of the two. They're going to need Russian gas.
Today, Putin said that one of the lines of the Nord Stream 2 is working, still is working. But he said he doesn't know if he's gonna send anything by this pipeline. And
well, he can't. It's not his decision. Germany is the one who shut down the pipeline. Germany is the one who said that Russia can't flow gas until certain regulatory, procedures are met. But it's a pure smokescreen. Germany was doing the United States bidding and coming up with a legalistic approach to stop it. Plus there's EU sanctions. Even if Germany wanted to open up the pipeline, they couldn't because EU sanctions Russian energy. So I don't think Putin has said all along, if you want the gas, it's here. We'll sell it to you for rubles. But Germany's not in a position to buy it because they've locked themselves in policy-wise. Right now, the only hope for Europe is Turk Stream.
Today, he was talking about a new pipeline and gas hub in Turkey. He was suggesting it to Erdogan. How do you see this movement of Putin? His concentration was on the West before this, but he's shifting his view to the East. How do you see this movement of Putin?
Well, I mean, it's a movement that's been facilitated 100% by the United States and Europe. It's the United States that sanctioned the totality of the Russian economy, compelling Russia to divorce itself from the Western economy.
Tactical nuclear weapons. The use of tactical nuclear weapons. What does it mean, tactical? Do we have limited nukes? I don't understand this.
Well, back in the day when we were preparing to fight nuclear war, I was in a Marine Corps artillery unit that had a tactical nuclear warhead, 155 millimeter, 203 millimeter. What does it mean? It means we fire and 1.5 to 15 kilotons worth of high explosive in the distance, and whoever's there dies. But the idea was to use it on a battlefield, not to have a global exchange. But today, we've de-emphasized tactical nukes to the point that there's no more artillery shells on either side. The United States uses B-61 air-delivered bombs. The Russians have tactical nuclear weapons on their Iskander missiles and some other tactical missiles. But their utility is questioned. Why? The Russians don't believe in tactical nukes. The Russians don't believe in limited nuclear war. Russia believes in massive retaliation. Russia believes that if somebody fires a nuclear weapon against them, they will use all their nuclear weapons against the enemy. Russia believes that if somebody threatens the security of Russia, the survivability of Russia using conventional forces, then Russia will respond nuclearly with nuclear weapons. But Russia is not going to launch a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukraine. There's no reason for them to do that. It's not part of their doctrine. They don't need to. They're winning the war. Why would you use a nuke? The only people talking about nukes is the West. We have President Zelensky of Ukraine begging NATO to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against Russia. And a few days after he says that, we have Jan Stoltenberg saying, I know things are tense right now, but we're going to hold our nuclear exercise next week. Really? You're going to hold a nuclear exercise, which basically practices dropping B-61 bombs on Russians, and you're going to hold it after the Ukrainian president asked you to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against Russia. It's stupid. The West is literally intellectually bankrupt here. There should be no nuclear exercise next week. They shouldn't hold a nuclear exercise while Russia is engaged in Ukraine, because you don't want mistakes to be made. You don't want miscalculations to be made. But they're going to do it anyways. The West literally is feckless and brainless.
See. Oh, the other thing that we see that Putin took some part of eastern Ukraine, but we have Odessa still not captured. Do you think Putin is planning to capture these areas?
Well, we know going in that Putin didn't plan on taking Kherson or Zaporizhia. He might have expanded Crimea to include the section of Kherson that deals with water, because Ukraine had cut off water from Crimea. So there's an issue of water security. But we know that when the Ukrainians and the Russians met in Istanbul in early April, that the Russians were ready to have a negotiated settlement. They were prepared to do this. And I think Ukraine was prepared as well. A settlement that recognized Crimea, gave independence to Lugansk and Donetsk, but that was it. Everything else would stay with Ukraine. Under instructions from the British, which means under the instructions from the United States and NATO, the Ukrainians withdrew from that negotiation. Now the fighting has gone on. NATO has made a decision to transform the nature of this conflict by becoming a de facto proxy, turning Ukraine into the proxy of NATO. The Ukrainian military today is built in the model of NATO, equipped like NATO, operates like NATO. It's NATO intelligence, NATO communications, NATO logistics. It's a NATO army. And so to deal with this, Russia had to change the game itself. Instead of engaging in a battle with the Ukrainian military or NATO proxy on Ukrainian soil, Russia turned this Ukrainian soil into Mother Russia. It's now part of Russia, which means it has the constitutional protections that all Russia has. And this gives Russia extraordinary latitude in evicting Ukrainian troops from Russian soil. It also is a limiting factor in terms of any support NATO might provide, because NATO has to be careful not crossing that red line of being seen as attacking the Russian state, lest Russia say, you violated one of our nuclear red lines, and now we nuke NATO. So that's why Russia took it. Now, Putin and other Russian officials had talked about the importance of protecting Russians. Odessa is an area dominated by Russians. So is Kharkov. There are significant Russian populations in Nikolaev, and Dnipropetrovsk. So a total of 4 more Ukrainian territories with significant Russian populations. If Zelensky wanted a ceasefire right now, I believe all 4 of those territories would remain as part of Ukraine. There might be some negotiation about Odessa to demilitarize it so that there's no more missiles that could sink Russian ships. But by and large, I think Russia would accept that. But if Zelensky wants to continue this fight, I think they're going to lose all 4 of those territories, and those 4 territories will be absorbed into Russia, just like the first 4 were, especially Odessa, which will lock Ukraine away from the sea and link Russia with the Transnistria breakaway province in Moldova. Again, Russians who have been disenfranchised by the Cold War. Russia would link up with them and provide continuity and possibly invite them to join Russia. But I think that's going to happen. I think Kharkov will become Russian, and I think the other 2 might as well. So Ukraine's in danger of losing, close to 50% of their national territory. And once you start carving Ukraine up, what's to stop the Poles from moving into Western Ukraine? Stop the Hungarians from moving into their contested area, the Romanians moving into their contested area. Ukraine can be carved up, and at the end of the day, what remains of Ukraine will be unrecognizable. That's the danger that Ukraine faces in continuing this fight.
It seems that the only country in the Europe that is willing to war with Russia is Poland. I don't understand why the Poles are so ready to fight Russians. How is it? Something in their history? Something in
Well, there's definitely a lot of Poland used to be part of what was called Galicia. Galicia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and also part of the Russian Empire. And it's a piece of territory that the 2 empires had fought back and forth over. So there's sort of an identity crisis with Poland on that. At the end of the First World War, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed and the Russian Empire collapsed, the state of Poland was created. And it included a large chunk of territory where the city of Lvov is and other cities. Today we call it Western Ukraine, but at the time it was Poland. There was a lot of people don't realize that in 1920, 1921, the Poles fought a war with the Soviet Union, and that the Soviet Union sent the famous First Cavalry Army commanded by Budini to rush the Polish capital of Warsaw. Then there was the miracle on the Vistula where the Polish army stood, fought, and then ultimately pushed the Soviets back. And they went beyond what we call Western Ukraine. They actually went on to capture Kiev and threaten, but they were forced to withdraw, only accept what they captured. That border stayed until 1939 when the Russians, because we talk about history, there had been a peace agreement that had been negotiated at the end of the First World War that set the borders of Poland. And the Russians or the Soviets viewed the territory that Poland took in 1921 as being illegitimate. And so when the Germans invaded in September 1939, prior to that, they had a secret agreement with the Soviets, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which basically carved Poland up. And it gave that territory back to the Soviet Union. So what is now Western Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. When the Germans invaded Russia, they took that back over, reincorporated it into this larger authority. But at the end of the Second World War, Stalin once again stripped it away. So the people who live in that part, Western Ukraine today, they don't have much love for Russians, for Soviets, etc. They also don't have much love for the Poles. What they do have love for is the notion of an independent Ukraine. But not a Ukraine that includes Eastern Ukraine with the Russians. They view the Russians as bad people. They don't want to deal with them. They don't want to deal with Poles either. They want racial purity, racial harmony. And this is where most of the angst and anger comes from about Russia and the Poles, about Western Ukraine. The Poles believe today that if Russia is carving up, the Russian-speaking portions, that the Poles will have a right to go in and claim Western Ukraine. There's a real potential that could happen. It's also, if that happens, there's a real potential that Belarus will join the conflict, because Belarus will not allow Poland to take Western Ukraine. So there will be a war. But that's where we're at. The Poles have a lot of historical animosity against the Soviets and the Russians. Unfortunately, this animosity is suicidal in nature, because the Poles can't beat Russia. They won't beat Russia. They're trying. I mean, the Poles are sending thousands of their troops into Ukraine, disguised as Ukrainian soldiers, where they're fighting on the front line. They're not fooling anybody. The Russians have the dead bodies. The Russians have the passports. They know what's going on. The danger here is that Poland, by putting so many Polish troops disguised as Ukrainian troops into Ukraine, at some point in time, Poland could declare them to be Polish troops, and now they're occupying Ukraine. And they'll claim it that this is ours, and now NATO protects them and all this. Very dangerous situation. The Poles are irrational when it comes to Russia, and are prone to make decisions that reflect this lack of rational thought.
I see. And one of the other day I was reading an article was describing that the NATO ultimate goal was to encircle Russia. You see, from the Black Sea, you see the Ukraine, Georgia, Turkey. You cut the connection of the Russia to the Black Sea. But by this, do you see as this description as logical or no?
Well, I mean, it's logical if you're a Pole. They're ones pushing for it. I think it's called the three C's strategy or something of that nature. But the idea is, again, to surround Russia with, this circle of anti-Russian forces. It's not logical. The Russians won't allow it. I mean, this is one of the reasons why Russia's fighting for Ukraine, to destroy that concept. If Russia succeeds in, for instance, taking Odessa, that's the end of the three C's concept, because Poland will have lost connectivity with the Black Sea. So too bad, Poland. But no, the Russians are aware of this. The plan is not secret. It's been published. And the Russians will do everything they can to make sure that the plan won't see the light of day.
I see. And the final question, Scott. We now see the partial mobilization of 300,000 Russians, plus we have the winter coming. And how do you see these two, the combination of this partial mobilization together with winter? What gonna cause to Ukraine the combination of these two forces?
Well, the mobilization of 300,000 troops is important. Unfortunately, my dogs are barking because people are at the door, but I'll try and answer this question quickly. The 300,000 troops will be a game changer in terms of numbers. The troops are also going to be very effective because they aren't professional troops. They used to be, but they're not anymore. They know that the quickest way home is by winning this war. So they're not going to tolerate sitting around doing nothing. They're going to want to get the job done. And you combine that with the following thing. It's the rainy season now, the Rasputitsa, I think the Russians call it, the muddy season. The situation is going to stabilize because nobody can fight in the mud. Ukraine is getting weaker because they bled away their reserves in this counteroffensive. Russia's going to be getting stronger. And by the time General Winter comes in, the Russians will have achieved their full strength. And with General Winter comes frozen ground, which means the Russians now can maneuver. I think it's all playing into Russia's hands. Ukraine's getting weaker. At this moment, when they have some potential advantages, the mud's coming in, it's going to slow them down. Then Russia builds up its strength, hiding behind the mud. And then when the winter comes, Russia will be able to attack. But remember, regardless of the weather, Russia still has the advantage in terms of the missiles, which will be bombarding Ukraine, destroying energy infrastructure, lines of communication, things of that nature. So I think basically everything aligns with Russia. All the advantages accrue to Russia.
Thanks for watching. If you like our videos, please hit the button below to like.